When we fire the gas kiln, it takes 2 days. A day to heat up to reach a temperature of 2300 degrees Fahrenheit, and then a day to cool down before we can open it. When the door is opened and the cars rolled out and we're able to examine the fruits of our labors. In this video, I'm going to show you how a lot of these pieces were glazed, and you'll be able to see how they look when they're raw glazed, and then the transformation that occurs after they've been fired in the kiln. The pieces are placed in the kiln on kiln shelves that are made of a type of a ceramic material that will not be affected by the heat, and the shelves are supported by ceramic kiln posts that allow us flexibility in the spacing of the kiln shelves. Sometimes we have to put pieces on top of shards to hold them so that they don't stick to the kiln shelf. Now here I am preparing the bisque before glazing, and that means to clean it of all dust and remove any roughness with sandpaper before applying the glaze. So I'm just taking a damp sponge and wiping each piece and blowing the dust off. Dust is a bad thing. Dust and oil, dirt in general, because it can act as a separator for the glaze, to keep the glaze from sticking to the bisque surface. And if we don't clean the dust off, we can end up with places where the glaze crawled when it was fired, when it melted and it separated from those places where the dust was, where the dust didn't let it grab onto the surface. So here are our glazes. These are the cone tin glazes that we have. We have 20 of them. And they're each one marked with a label with a name on it. And then hanging above each one is a sample of what the glaze looks like when it's fired. And you can tell a lot from those samples. Like, you can tell if the surface is glossy or matte. You can tell if the glaze is transparent or opaque by how clearly that dark stripe shows up. If you can't see the stripe, then the glaze is opaque. And the samples also tell you if there's variation in the color according to thickness, because each sample is dipped in the glaze twice. Now, a very important part of glazing is to stir the glazes before using them. And you can use a whisk or you can use some other thing to stir with, but the best thing to use is your hand. There's nothing in those glazes that's going to hurt your skin. And using your hand allows you to tell if every bit of the glaze residue is up off the bottom of the bucket and in suspension. And it takes a bit of doing to stir these glazes, especially if you're the first one to use them that day, because they settle in the bottom of the bucket, and takes sometimes 30 seconds to a minute of steady stirring to get them to the right consistency and the right mixture before use. A lot of the faults of poor glazing happen because the glaze wasn't stirred enough. Now, these glazes are made of raw minerals that we put together according to a recipe, and these minerals change color when they're fired. So this glaze looks reddish brown, but when it's fired, it might be a deep blue color. So we have to stir the glaze, and sometimes we have to add water to adjust the consistency to get it to the exactly right consistency. We want them to be the consistency of of a light cream, a little bit heavier than milk, but not as heavy as syrup. So think about those differences in viscosity. And when you're stirring the glaze, if it seems to be too thick or too thin, ask your instructor to help you get it just right. Now here I've dipped this bowl in a white glaze, and then I am pouring another glaze on top to create two areas and leaving the white glaze showing in the middle. And when we apply the glaze, we want to make sure that the glaze covers exactly the areas that we want. But here I'm dipping the lid of a teapot. Again, it was already dipped in a white glaze and allowed to dry. And now I'm dipping the top of the lid in a dark blue glaze. And here I'm about to do the same to the teapot itself. It's already been dipped in a white glaze. And now I'm going to over dip that in this dark blue glaze. Got to hold it, give it a few seconds to dry for the water to be absorbed from the glaze into the ceramic piece. So don't immediately pull it out and turn it up, because then the glaze may drip and run all down the sides. I got a couple of drips there, but I will scrape those off when the glaze dries. And here you can see the fired piece where the glaze had that blue that dripped over the white, and the white is showing through in places. Very shiny, very glassy. The glaze didn't go inside because I held it upside down, and the air inside kept the glaze from going inside. As you can see, it can take a while to stir the glaze enough. And if you watch this particular bucket, you watch the surface quality of this glaze, it changes. It gets thicker as I'm stirring it. You see now it's smoother and creamier as I am mixing the water on top with the sediment on the bottom. And then I'm taking some of that glaze with a bulb syringe and trailing it onto the surface of the piece. And again, this is on top of an already dry glaze. So this glaze is going to turn deep burgundy red on top of this white glaze. And you'll see what these look like when they're fired a little bit later in this video. And don't forget to put the lids back on the buckets when you get through with them. Here, this glaze has not been stirred yet. You can see a lot of water standing on top. I put my hand all the way to the bottom and pull it out, and you can see there's clear water on top and thick sediment on the bottom. So that has to be stirred and made evenly distributed before it can be used. Now this glaze is called Wright's Green, R-E-I-T-Z, after famous potter named Don Wrights. And he developed this glaze. It's a matte finish glaze, and when it is applied thin, it's a black color. But when it is a thicker application, it's a deep green. And when the application is just right, you will have the green overall, but where there's texture or where there's patterns or changes in the form, then the black will show through. Here I'm touching up some areas where my fingers were holding the bowl, as I was dipping it before I dip it a second time. And the glaze is a little on the thin side. It's a little bit watery. So I held it under the surface of the glaze to the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And that ensures that I get a thick enough coat to give me the color that I want. I'm going to show you what the finished fired bowl looks like in just a second. There it is, that green color where the glaze is thicker, and the black where the texture shows through, where the glaze breaks on the surface of the form. It was a very interesting glaze, and for certain pieces it is the best one in my opinion. But this glaze is called Tan Matte. It's another matte finish glaze, not glossy. And you get different shades of tan or orange or brown depending upon how thick or thin the glaze is. Now this piece is a slab constructed form that I'm going to dip. It was too large to dip into a 5-gallon bucket of glaze, so I poured the glaze, transferred it into this larger metal bowl that's large enough for the piece to be dipped into. Dipping is the best way to glaze a piece so that you get an even coat. More than any other method of brushing, pouring, or spraying, dipping is the best way to get an even coat that is neither too thick or too thin. The glaze that I'm using here is called Tan Matte, which means it's a tan color, but it's a dull finish, not a glossy finish. And then I'm taking a glossy white glaze in a bulb syringe and applying it to some of the embossed areas on the pot. And that little drip of glaze that ran off can be scraped off when the glaze is dry, as you see here. And then a glossy black glaze is placed as well. In glazing, you have to have an idea in your mind how these things are going to work together. And that comes through experience, through having used these individual glazes many times before. I have an understanding of how they react individually and together. So I can visualize in my mind that this piece is going to be a yellowish tan color, not this pale brick red color, and that those chalky black and white glazes are actually going to be glossy. I know that from experience that that's how they're going to be after the firing. Just applying a little bit of the black to some textured areas of the form to add a little visual interest, designed to make you look. Wiping the glaze off the bottom. Have to do on every single thing. And that's even if wax resist is used on the bottoms prior to glaze application. A lot of people like to apply wax resist, let that dry, and then when they dip the piece in a glaze, wax. Now here's the finished piece. This is after the firing. So you can see the colors that became, and the finish that became on the piece from the firing. And I was mistaken earlier. That wasn't a shiny white glaze. That was a red glaze, a shiny red glaze. And we can see the texture on the surface of the slab that was created when I rolled it out, that came through the glaze. I like that this glaze gives variations in color depending upon how thick it is, and that's what makes that texture show up, is the variation in thickness, where the glaze is thicker. Now here I'm about to dip a goblet into a bucket of white glaze. Smooth white because I can see the sample hanging there. And another. And I'm rotating the pieces in the glaze to make sure that they get enough of a coating, an even coating. Dab a little bit where my fingertips were touching the rim. And then sponge off the base. Now this glaze is not a runny glaze, so I don't have to clean up the side of the piece very far, just on the bottom and around the corner of the bottom edge. Now I'm applying a little bit of underglaze on top of the white glaze. Some bands of color. So we can apply underglaze underneath the transparent glaze or on top of any other glaze, on top of any glaze. I like to use underglazes this way when I want to paint a design that I want to stay still. I don't want it to run when the glaze is melted. Now this piece I've dipped in the white glaze and then added some designs with wax resist. When the wax resist dried, then I dipped the goblet, the top of the goblet, in another glaze, and the part that was protected by the wax resist will show up as a decorative line. in that dark glaze. And I'm using a clean wet brush to remove the glaze that was not resisted completely by the wax resist. And you have to do this every time you use wax resist, especially if it's on the bottom of the pot, because glaze will stick to it. And it might be just a few beads of glaze, or it might be quite a bit, like on the surface here. So it has to do with the amount of wax resist that you put on and the viscosity of the glaze that's on top of it. A thicker glaze will tend to do as you see here on mine, and leave a layer on top of the wax. So I'm using this wet brush to remove the glaze on top of the wax. It's not removing the wax, just the glaze that covered the wax. So this pinkish glaze is a celadon, which means it's a transparent glaze that fires a jade green color. It's especially beautiful on porcelain. Adding some little flourishes to add attention to the form. Putting some yellow underglaze on top of the white glaze. It all cleans up with water. Just have to make sure everything is well stirred or well shaken, because they do tend to settle to the bottom when they haven't been used for a while. Another good thing about underglazes is the colors are pretty true before and after firing, whereas the base glazes may be completely different colors before and after firing. A red underglaze is going to be red when you paint it on, and the yellow is going to be yellow. So you'll be able to judge for yourselves right then how those colors work together. Now we have the finished goblets that you just saw glazed, and now they're after firing. And you can see how the colors that were reddish brown when they were applied have turned, like that dark blue and like that green, and they become glassy and shiny. The clay is what we call matured and vitrified so that it will hold water. The pieces are very strong. And now we're moving on to glazing the next piece, that's a large bowl. So stirring the glaze well, and then the bowl just fit into the 5-gallon bucket. Just barely fit. Let it dry for a couple of minutes. Now I'm going to apply a little wax resist on the inside of the bowl in a decorative pattern. Put a line around the inside of the rim and a line around where the wall transitions into the bottom. So I've divided the interior into two areas. I've got the circular area in the bottom, and I've got the ring of the wall around it. So I have these two areas that I can then put decoration in. And applying those two lines has given a little bit of structure to the surface. You may not have been aware of those two areas, but you are now, since I outlined them with wax. And now I'm doing kind of a floral design in wax that's going across those areas. So the wax is going to preserve the glaze, that reddish brown glaze, and whatever I put next will be preserved, will be resisted by the glaze. So this is a glossy white glaze called leech white that I'm pouring in, and I had let the wax dry for a few minutes, like 10 or 15 minutes, before applying the glaze. And then just dipping the rim. And you can see that the wax resist worked pretty well. The glaze was not so thick that it couldn't be resisted by the wax, like you saw a little earlier in this video, where the glaze did not run off the wax. Here I'm just touching up with my fingers. We're holding the bowl as I dipped it upside down. Now I'm going to take a wet sponge and blot up the excess glaze that stayed behind on top of the wax. Now, anytime you put a white glaze on top of a dark glaze, you're going to find when it's fired that the white ends up with lots of little circular patterns in it. And that's from bubbles that are formed in the white glaze when it melts that will allow the glaze below to bubble through it. So it creates kind of a lacy pattern. Now here is that very same bowl after the firing, and you can see the floral shape, you can see the lines, and you can also see all the little holes in the white glaze in the way I was just describing. And those were formed by bubbles in the glaze during the firing. Next, I'm going to be glazing a teapot in a glaze called Mark's Temuku. And this glaze is reddish brown with one dip and black when you dip the same piece twice. So I have a plan to take advantage of it, and we'll have to see how it turns out. So I dipped it once, dipped the teapot and the lid once in the glaze, and after it dried, applied some wax resist. So once the wax resist is dry, the teapot is dipped a second time in the same glaze, Mark's Temuku, in hopes that the reddish brown flower design will show up against the black background. And here you see the fired result. Unfortunately, the design didn't come out as clear as I'd hoped. You can see little bits of the reddish brown in areas, but I think the glaze ran in the firing and obscured the wax resistant part. That's what happens. Doesn't always work out the way you want. But it is a nice, shiny, even coated glaze. It'll be a very nice, functional teapot. Now this time I'm glazing a white teapot. I'm glazing a teapot with a white glaze. And so after stirring, dip the lid, hold it until it stops dripping. And then dip the body of the teapot, coating it inside and out. And all those variations in the glaze coating that you see, places where there's drips and so forth, those will smooth out and will not show up in the fired teapot. Now, it didn't show this, but the teapot was dipped partially. The top of the teapot was dipped in another glaze that's going to come out a dark blue. And now I'm taking a third glaze and brushing on a thin coat of mottled orange glaze. And that will just give some variation to the dark blue that's there, that appears to be reddish brown right now. And here's the fired teapot, the very same one. And you can see the streaks and the milky colors. That's from the mottled orange modifying the dark blue, and also caused the dark blue to run a little bit down the sides of the teapot. Now I am loading up an atomizer sprayer. So this is a way to spray glaze by blowing into the mouthpiece to give a light coating of glaze. So this is the same mottled orange, and on top of these tiles where I already have combinations of other glazes, I'm just giving a light coating of mottled orange. And this, I'm hoping, will just give a little variation to whatever the colors are. Nothing drastic, just a softening, a lightening of the colors, because that mottled orange will come out a light color, depending upon what it's sprayed on top of. The glazes mix and affect each other. So I find it an easy way to get variation in a glaze that might just be one solid color. Now, sometimes the sprayed on glaze is too light to show up. As you'll see in the last segment of this video, you'll see what these tiles look like when they're fired, and there are descriptions of the glazes that are used and how they're applied. So this particular glaze is a clear glaze, but I'm spraying the mottled orange over all of them. And here I'm giving an accent of mottled orange brushed on top of a dip coating of chain celadon and a trail of copper red glaze, and there's the fired result of that very piece. Now, this plate has been glazed with a deep blue called Noxema blue and a little swirl brushstroke of mottled orange. And this plate has been coated in Marks Temaku, which is black, and I believe we'll have a view of what it looks like fired. This little plate has white and then mottled orange brushed on top of it. That was real quick, but that was that plate that I just put a swipe of mottled orange on. And then this is a little cup that had some decoration with colored slips, and I'm dipping it in the chain celadon, and you'll see in just a second what that looks like. There it is. You can see the colored slip show up real well through the jade green celadon. And then these are the tiles. So you'll have to pause the video in order to see the text and understand what is on the tile. So I hope this will be helpful for you in learning about glazes and how important it is to stir them enough, keep them stirred, and then pay attention to the thickness of them, and especially in the thickness as you apply them, because you may be layering 2, 3, or 4 glazes, as I've done here, on each one of these tiles. So good luck. Don't give up.